The river moves, as it has always moved, slow and broad and heavy with silt. In the dry months, its waters settle between banks of cracked mud, exposing sandbars where ibises pick their way on stilt-thin legs. When the floods come, the Nile swells beyond recognition, spreading across the floodplain in a mirror of brown water that reflects nothing but sky. And when the waters recede, they leave behind a layer of black soil, rich and deep, the gift that makes life possible in a land where rain almost never falls. This is the rhythm that shaped everything. The flood, the planting, the harvest, the dry season waiting for the flood to come again. A cycle as reliable as sunrise, as predictable as the stars wheeling overhead in their appointed courses. The people who came to live along these banks 5,000 years before the Common Era learned to read the river's moods with an intimacy born of absolute dependence. They watched the color of the water, the height of the flood against markers they established on the banks, the timing of the inundation's arrival. Their survival depended on this knowledge, passed from generation to generation, refined and elaborated, until it became something approaching science. The earliest farming communities appeared along the Nile's edges around 5000 BC, part of a broader shift happening across the ancient world, as people learned to cultivate plants and domesticate animals, abandoning the mobile hunting and gathering lifestyles their ancestors had practiced for hundreds of thousands of years. In Egypt, this transformation was shaped entirely by the river. The narrow green valley, never more than a dozen miles wide, and often much less, dictated where people could live, how they could farm, what resources were available to them. Beyond the reach of the annual flood, life became almost impossible. The desert waited, red and empty, a barrier more effective than any wall. At sites like Merimda Beni Salama in the western delta, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of villages dating to this earliest period. The settlement sprawled across an area of nearly 40 acres, making it one of the largest known communities of its time. People built simple houses of bundled reeds and mud, structures that would have needed constant repair and reconstruction, but which could be erected quickly with materials found along the riverbank. The houses were small, often oval or horseshoe-shaped, with floors of trampled earth and hearths for cooking and warmth during the surprisingly cold nights of the Egyptian winter. The excavators found storage pits dug into the ground, lined with baskets to hold grain, while they found grinding stones for processing wheat and barley, the first domesticated crops that would sustain Egyptian civilization for its entire 3,000-year history. They found the bones of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, showing that animal husbandry had already become established. And they found pottery, simple vessels shaped by hand, without the potter's wheel, decorated with rippled patterns, or left plain, fired in open pits, rather than kilns. These were people learning to be farmers, adapting skills developed elsewhere to the unique conditions of the Nile Valley, creating something new in the process. Further south, in Upper Egypt, different communities were developing their own solutions to the challenges of riverside life. At Badari, on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt, excavations revealed cemeteries and settlement remains from slightly later than Merimda, around 4,400 to 4000 BC. The Badarian people became known for their distinctive pottery, thin-walled vessels of exceptional quality, often polished to a lustrous finish and fired in ways that created a characteristic black rim against the red-brown body of the pot. These were not simple utilitarian containers, but objects of real aesthetic achievement, suggesting that even in these early centuries, people invested time and skill in creating beauty. The Badarian graves tell us something about how these people viewed death and the world beyond. Bodies were buried on their left sides, heads pointing south, facing west, toward the setting sun. With them went the possessions they would need in the afterlife. Pottery vessels presumably containing food and drink, shell and bone jewelry, stone tools, cosmetic palettes for grinding malachite and other minerals into eye paint. The care taken with these burials speaks of a belief that death was not an ending but a transition, that the dead continued to exist in some form and required provisions for their journey. The river in those days looked different than it does now. The Nile's course has shifted over millennia, ancient channels silting up and new ones forming. The level of the floodplain has risen dramatically, burying the settlements of the Predynastic period under meters of accumulated silt. When archaeologists excavate these early sites, they often work far below the modern surface, digging down through layers of mud deposited by 5,000 annual floods. The Egypt these first farmers knew is gone, preserved only in fragments buried beneath the Egypt that came after. Yet the rhythm remains. The Aswan High Dam has ended the annual flood, trapping the Nile's waters in Lake Nasser, but the river still flows north to the Mediterranean, still carries the mountains of East Africa to the sea. Stand on the bank today, and you can imagine how it was then. The morning light on the water, the flight of waterfowl across the marshes, the distant line of the desert plateau marking the edge of the habitable world. The scale is the same, the fundamental geography unchanged despite all the centuries that have passed. By 4000 BC, communities were established all along the Nile Valley, from the delta to the first cataract at Aswan. These were not isolated villages, but part of a network connected by the river. Boats made of bundled papyrus reeds, or later of wood, moved people and goods up and down the Nile. The current carried boats north toward the delta and the sea. The wind, blowing consistently from the north, filled simple square sails and pushed boats south against the current. This elegant system made the Nile a highway more effective than any road, allowing the exchange of materials, ideas, and people across hundreds of miles. The communities of the north, in the broad delta region, developed somewhat differently from those in the south, in the narrow valley of Upper Egypt. Northern sites show evidence of more contact with the Levant and the broader Mediterranean world, visible in trade goods and stylistic influences. Southern sites seem to have been more focused on local developments, though still connected to the north through river trade. These regional differences would persist throughout Egyptian history, with the valley and the delta maintaining distinct identities even after political unification. At Nakada, a major site in Upper Egypt that would give its name to the archaeological culture of the later Predynastic period. Excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal thousands of graves spanning several centuries. The sheer number of burials and the variation in their contents provided archaeologists with a detailed sequence showing how material culture changed over time. Simple graves with a few pots gradually gave way to more elaborate burials with increasing quantities of grave goods. Pottery styles evolved from simple rippled and polished wares to vessels painted with complex decorative schemes. Stone tools became more refined, and copper objects began to appear, marking the beginning of metallurgy in Egypt. The Nakada sequence, refined and elaborated by generations of scholars, became the framework for understanding all of Predynastic Egypt. Nakada, or roughly 4000 to 3500 BC, held the continuation of Badarian traditions, with increasing sophistication in pottery and crafts. Nakada II, from 3500 to 3200 BC, witnessed rapid cultural development, population growth, the emergence of clear social hierarchies, and the first evidence of writing. Nakada III, blending into the early dynastic period around 3200 to 3000 BC, marked the transition to unified statehood and the beginning of pharaonic civilization. But these are analytical categories, imposed by modern scholars. The people living through these centuries would not have perceived sudden breaks or transitions. Change happened slowly, each generation inheriting the world their parents made and modifying it only slightly before passing it to their own children. A potter might improve slightly on traditional designs. A farmer might experiment with new planting techniques. A craftsperson might discover a better method for working flint or shaping copper. Across centuries, these small innovations accumulated into transformations that, viewed from our distant perspective, seem dramatic and sudden. The villages grew, houses became more substantial, built of mud brick rather than reeds and matting. Storage facilities increased in size and sophistication, suggesting greater agricultural surplus. Workshops appeared where specialized craftspeople produced pottery, stone tools, textiles, and other goods. Temples or shrines, difficult to identify with certainty in the archaeological record, but likely present in some form, provided focal points for communal ritual. The dead were buried in cemeteries at the edge of the desert, away from the agricultural land, but still within sight of the living community. And always, the river. Its presence shaped everything: where people built their houses, when they planted and harvested, how they traveled, what they ate, how they understood the world. The Egyptians would later personify the Nile as Hapi, a deity of abundance, depicted with a sagging belly and full breasts, bringing the annual flood. But in these earlier centuries, before the complex pantheon of Egyptian religion took shape, the river probably required no personification. It simply was, the source and sustainer of all life, as fundamental as air or sunlight. The landscape of Egypt defined everything about how the ancient Egyptians understood their world. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, referring to the dark, fertile soil left by the Nile's annual flood. Everything beyond the reach of the inundation, they called Desret, the Red Land, the barren desert that surrounded the narrow green valley on both sides. This was not merely a geographical distinction, but a fundamental conceptual division that shaped Egyptian thought for 3 millennia. The Black Land was life, order, fertility, civilization. Here, Crops grew and animals grazed. Here, people built their villages and towns, their temples and tombs, halls. The Nile's flood, arriving with remarkable regularity each year, made agriculture possible in a region where rainfall was negligible. Without the river, Egypt would have been nothing but desert, uninhabitable except by small groups of nomadic hunters. With the river, it became one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world, capable of supporting large populations and the complex social structures that populations enabled. The Red Land was death, chaos, sterility, the wild. Yet it was not simply an enemy to be feared and avoided. The desert had its uses and its sacred qualities. From the desert came valuable minerals: gold from the eastern hills, copper from Sinai, turquoise and malachite from mines in the arid waste. The desert was where the dead were buried, their bodies desiccated naturally by the dry heat and sand, preserved for eternity, far from the moisture and decay of the floodplain. The desert was where one went to encounter the divine, to escape the ordered world of human society and enter liminal spaces where gods and spirits dwelt. The boundary between these two realms was sharp and visible. Stand in a field of cultivated land, and you can see the line where green ends and red begins, sometimes just a few paces away. The ancient Egyptians organized their entire cosmology around this division. Creation itself was understood as the emergence of order from chaos, the rising of the primordial mound from the waters of Nun, just as each year the land emerged from the receding flood. The king's primary responsibility was to maintain Ma'at, the order and harmony represented by the Black Land, and keep at bay Isfet, the chaos represented by the Red Land. In the Predynastic period, this conceptual framework was probably less developed, but the basic geography shaped people's lives and perceptions just as profoundly. Villages were built on slight elevations, gezeras or islands, that remained above water even during the highest floods. The land immediately around these settlements, intensively farmed, produced the grain that sustained the community. Beyond that, but still within the floodplain, stretched grazing lands for cattle and other livestock. At the very edge of cultivation began the low desert, the area just beyond the flood's reach, where cemeteries were located and where people might hunt for gazelle, hare, and other desert game. Beyond the low desert rose the high desert, the limestone plateaus and sandstone cliffs that marked the valley's edge. In the south, these cliffs pressed close to the river, sometimes rising directly from the floodplain in sheer escarpments hundreds of feet high. The valley itself was rarely more than a few miles wide, a narrow ribbon of green hemmed in by golden stone. In the north, the valley opened into the broad delta, where the Nile split into multiple channels and the landscape became one of marshes and lagoons before reaching the Mediterranean coast. The geological history that created this landscape stretched back millions of years. The Nile is one of the world's great rivers, flowing more than 4,000 miles from its sources in the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean. For millennia, it has carried the erosion of mountains to the sea, depositing layer upon layer of silt to create the Egyptian floodplain. The river's course has shifted repeatedly over geological time, cutting and refilling channels, building and abandoning deltas. The Egypt visible today is merely the most recent iteration of a landscape constantly being remade by water and sediment. The ancient Egyptians quarried stone from the desert cliffs for building and sculpture. Limestone from Tura and other sites near Memphis provided the fine white stone used for the outer casing of pyramids and for sculpture. Sandstone from quarries in the south became the primary building material for temples in Upper Egypt. Harder stones like granite, basalt, and diorite came from more distant locations and were reserved for special purposes: royal statuary, sarcophagi, items requiring durability or prestige. Even in the Predynastic period, people ventured into the desert for resources. They collected flint from nodules eroding out of the limestone, shaping it into knives, scrapers, arrowheads, and other tools. They mined minerals like malachite and galena for cosmetics, grinding the stones into powder to create eye paint that served both decorative and practical purposes, protecting the eyes from sun glare and possibly providing some antibacterial properties. Expeditions into the eastern desert sought gold, which occurred in veins in the igneous and metamorphic rocks of the Arabian Shield. These desert journeys were dangerous undertakings. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea was a landscape of jagged mountains and waterless wadis, ferociously hot during the day and bitterly cold at night. Travelers needed to know the locations of scattered wells and springs, the routes that avoided the most difficult terrain, the seasons when travel was possible. Rock inscriptions from later periods show that expeditions to the eastern desert quarries and mines could involve hundreds of men, requiring extensive logistical planning and the support of the state. In the Predynastic period, operations were surely smaller, but even a party of a dozen men venturing into the desert for a week required organization and knowledge. The Western Desert was different, a vast plateau of sand and rock, extending hundreds of miles to the west. A chain of oases, fed by groundwater from aquifers deep beneath the surface, punctuated this expanse. Bahariya, Farafra, Dakla, Karga. In later periods, these oases were settled and integrated into the Egyptian state, but in predynastic times they seem to have been inhabited primarily by pastoralists, people who herded cattle and other livestock through the desert, moving between wells and seasonal grazing areas. Recent archaeological work has revealed that the Sahara was not always the hyper-arid desert it is today. During periods of increased rainfall, most recently from about 9000 to 4000 BC, the desert supported grasslands and savanna. Lakes and streams existed in areas now completely dry. Rock art from this period, found at sites across the Sahara, depicts cattle, giraffes, elephants, and other animals that require more water than the modern desert can provide. People lived in regions now uninhabitable, following their herds across landscapes that have since turned to sand. As the climate dried, probably gradually, but with periods of more rapid change, the desert became less hospitable. Pastoralists moved to areas where water remained more reliable, particularly the Nile Valley. Some scholars have suggested that this process of desiccation and migration contributed to the population growth visible in the Predynastic Nile Valley, as people from drying pastoral regions settled along the river and adopted agricultural lifestyles. Whether this happened as a steady trickle or in more dramatic movements remains debated, but the correlation between climatic change and cultural development seems significant. The Nile itself was and is a product of climate. Its flood comes from monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, feeding the Blue Nile and the Atbara River, which join the White Nile at Khartoum. The White Nile, flowing from the Great Lakes of East Africa, provides a more constant flow, but contributes less to the flood. The Blue Nile and Atbara, swollen by summer rains in the highlands, caused the dramatic annual rise that made Egyptian agriculture possible. When the rains fail in Ethiopia, the flood is low. When they are abundant, the flood is high. This connection between Egypt's fertility and rainfall, 1,000 miles to the south, was not understood by the ancient Egyptians, who attributed the flood to the will of the gods, but they experienced its effects directly. A low flood meant hunger. Fields could not be properly irrigated. Crops failed. Stored grain from previous years had to sustain the population until the next flood. A series of low floods could lead to famine, social disruption, even the collapse of governments. A flood that was too high brought different problems. Villages inundated, houses destroyed, people and animals drowned. The ideal flood was one that spread across the floodplain to the proper depth, stayed long enough to saturate the soil thoroughly, then receded in time for planting. The landscape of black land and red land, of river valley and desert, of flood and drought, shaped not only how Egyptians farmed and built and organized their settlements, but how they thought about order and chaos, life and death, the nature of kingship, and the responsibilities of the gods. The geography was not merely a backdrop, but an active force in Egyptian civilization, as fundamental as the people themselves. A village in Predynastic Egypt, around 4000 BC, was not impressive by later standards. No stone temples or palaces, no monumental sculpture or towering walls, just a cluster of houses built from the most basic materials imaginable. Mud from the riverbank, reeds from the marshes, wood from the few trees that grew along the Nile. These structures would have seemed temporary, impermanent, more like large baskets than proper buildings. Yet they sheltered families for generations, were rebuilt and repaired and modified as needed, and created communities that would endure for centuries. The typical house began with a simple framework of poles or reeds, driven into the ground to form a rough circle or oval. More reeds or bundles of straw were woven between these uprights to create walls, sometimes plastered with mud to make them more solid and weatherproof. The roof was made the same way, though it needed to be stronger to support its own weight and shed the rare rain. Inside, the floor was simply the ground, trampled smooth and sometimes covered with mats of woven reeds. A hearth in the center or toward one side provided warmth and a place to cook. Smoke escaped through the doorway or gaps in the roof. These were single-room dwellings, perhaps 10 or 12 feet across, sheltering an extended family of 6 or 8 people. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. People slept on mats on the floor, bodies close together for warmth, on cold nights. Possessions were few and mostly utilitarian. Pottery jars for storing grain, water, and other foodstuffs. Grinding stones for processing wheat and barley into flour. wooden or bone tools, baskets for carrying and storage, perhaps a few items of personal adornment, shell or bone beads strung into necklaces and bracelets. As villages grew and became more established, houses evolved. Mud brick, made by mixing Nile mud with straw or chaff and forming it into rectangular blocks, then drying them in the sun, became the standard building material. Mud brick was more durable than reeds, easier to work with, and could be used to create rectangular structures rather than round ones. Rectangular buildings could be expanded more easily, could be divided into multiple rooms, could be built in rows sharing walls. The mud brick houses of later Predynastic period were still small and simple by modern standards, but they represented real improvements in comfort and functionality. Walls were thicker, providing better insulation against heat and cold. Roofs were flat, made of palm logs covered with reeds and mud, creating usable space for sleeping on hot nights or for drying fish and grain. Some houses had multiple rooms, a main living space, smaller rooms for storage or for sleeping, perhaps a small courtyard. The doorway faced away from the prevailing north wind, providing shelter while still allowing air circulation. Archaeological excavations of Predynastic villages reveal much about their layout and organization. Houses were not arranged according to any formal plan, but clustered together in a seemingly haphazard fashion, separated by narrow lanes and open spaces. The spaces between buildings served multiple functions: work areas where people cooked, made pottery, repaired tools, processed food, play areas for children, gathering places for conversation and socializing, pens for animals. Most villages had areas devoted to specialized activities. Pottery kilns, producing the characteristic Predynastic wares, required open space and proximity to clay sources. These were often located at the edge of settlements. Grain storage, critical for survival, might take the form of large communal silos or individual pits dug into the ground and lined with baskets or matting. Evidence suggests both systems existed, perhaps reflecting different patterns of land ownership and social organization. The daily rhythm of village life followed the seasons and the sun. People rose at dawn and worked until midday, when the heat became oppressive. During the hottest hours, they rested in the shade, then resumed work in the late afternoon and evening, until darkness fell. Artificial light was minimal, small oil lamps or torches, so most activities ceased with nightfall. The agricultural calendar dictated the year's rhythm. Planting after the flood receded in the autumn, tending the growing crops through the winter and spring, harvesting in early summer before the next flood arrived. Men and women both worked in the fields during planting and harvest, the labor requirements too great for either sex alone. At other times of the year, labor was more gendered. Men hunted and fished, herded livestock, worked at crafts like flint knapping and woodworking. Women ground grain, baked bread, brewed beer, spun fibers into thread and wove textiles, made pottery in some communities, though this was not universally a female task. Children helped with whatever work they were capable of, fetching water, watching livestock, assisting in the fields during harvest. The daily diet was simple, but apparently adequate. Bread and beer, both made from wheat or barley, provided the majority of calories. Bread came in many forms, from coarse flat loaves to finer varieties made from more carefully ground flour. Beer was thick and nutritious, a food as much as a beverage, consumed by men, women, and children as part of the daily diet. To this staple base was added whatever else was available: onions and garlic, lentils and beans, dates and other fruits, fish caught in the Nile, birds hunted in the marshes, occasional meat from domesticated animals or wild game. Evidence from burials and skeletal remains suggests that most predynastic people were relatively healthy, at least by ancient standards. Life expectancy was short by modern measures, perhaps 30 to 35 years on average, but infant mortality was the primary factor dragging down the average. Those who survived childhood had a reasonable chance of living into their 40s or 50s, some even longer. People suffered from the diseases common to agricultural societies: dental problems from grit-laden bread, arthritis from hard physical labor, parasitic infections from the Nile's water, injuries from accidents and violence. Yet there is also evidence of care for the sick and injured. Some skeletons show healed fractures, suggesting that broken bones were set and that people were supported through their recovery rather than being abandoned. Bodies in graves are often accompanied by offerings, suggesting continued care even after death. The community, small and tightly knit, had mechanisms for dealing with misfortune and for supporting its members through difficulties. Villages were not isolated entities, but part of larger networks. People traveled to neighboring settlements for trade, for marriages that created alliances between families, for seasonal gatherings and festivals. The Nile made this movement relatively easy, at least in the north-south dimension. East-west travel, across the narrow valley from one bank to the other, was more limited but still occurred. Over generations, these connections created regional cultures, groups of villages sharing similar pottery styles, burial customs, and material culture, distinct from other regions. The impression one gets from the archaeological record is of communities that were small, stable, largely self-sufficient, but not isolated. Poor by the standards of later civilizations, but not desperately so. Life was hard, certainly. The labor of farming was unceasing. The margin between sufficiency and hunger often thin. The dangers of disease and accident ever present. But it was a life that people managed to sustain generation after generation, that allowed population growth, that created sufficient surplus to support specialists and craft production, that laid the foundations for everything that would come later. Walking through the ruins of these ancient villages today, which is to say walking through excavated pits and low mounds, where almost nothing remains visible above ground, requires imagination to reconstruct what once existed. The mud brick has dissolved back into the earth it came from. The reeds have long since rotted away. The people are gone, their voices silent, their stories lost, except for the fragmentary evidence they left behind. Yet that evidence, carefully excavated and studied, reveals a world that was vibrant and complex, fully human in its concerns and aspirations, as worthy of attention and respect as any later civilization. Among the most distinctive products of Predynastic Egypt were its ceramics, particularly the elaborately decorated vessels of the Naqada culture. These pots, ranging from small bottles to large storage jars, were not merely functional containers, but objects of real aesthetic achievement, decorated with painted designs that provide us with invaluable glimpses into the symbolic world of their makers. The earliest predynastic pottery, from the Badarian period around 4400 BC, consisted primarily of simple rippled or polished vessels. The surfaces were carefully smoothed, often burnished to create a lustrous finish, and fired in ways that created distinctive color effects. The characteristic Badarian pot was red or brown, with a black rim created by inverting the vessel in the fire during the final stage of firing, allowing carbon to darken the upper portion while the body remained lighter. These simple vessels, elegant in their restraint, continued to be made throughout the predynastic period, but they were joined by increasingly elaborate decorated wares. The pottery of Naqada Ivref, 4000 to 3500 BC, introduced white painted decoration on red polished vessels. The designs were primarily geometric, cross-hatched patterns, zigzags, dots, lines. Animal motifs began to appear as well. Hippos, crocodiles, birds, ibexes. These were rendered in a highly stylized manner, often difficult to identify with certainty. The painting was done with a white pigment, probably chalk or crushed limestone mixed with water, applied to the vessel after polishing but before firing. By Naqada II, from about 3500 to 3200 BC, the decorative vocabulary had expanded dramatically. Pottery from this period, often called decorated ware or seaware in archaeological literature, featured painted scenes of remarkable complexity and variety. Boats became a dominant motif, rendered in profile with high curved prows and sterns, banks of oars, cabins or shrines amidships, standards or emblems rising from the deck. These boats often carried human figures and were sometimes accompanied by plants, animals, or geometric designs. The boats are particularly intriguing because they seem to represent something more than simple transportation. Many are shown with multiple standards or emblems, symbols that would later be associated with specific nomes or administrative districts of Egypt. Some scholars interpret these decorated vessels as depicting ceremonial or religious processions, boats carrying gods or kings along the Nile. Others see them as representations of everyday river traffic, perhaps exaggerated or formalized for decorative purposes. The truth may involve both religious and secular elements, the Nile voyage being simultaneously a practical journey and a symbolic act. Other motifs appear as well: human figures with raised arms, possibly dancing or worshipping; women with arms upraised, possibly goddesses or priestesses; animals both real and fantastic, including lions, gazelles, bulls, dogs, and creatures that combine human and animal features; plant motifs, particularly stylized palm trees and other vegetation, frame or accompany the main scenes. The overall effect is of a rich symbolic vocabulary, a visual language that conveyed meaning to those who created and viewed these vessels, but which remains only partly comprehensible to us. The technical quality of this pottery is impressive. The vessels were hand-built, without the potter's wheel, which would not be introduced into Egypt until much later. Potters used the coiling technique, building up the walls from rings of clay, then smoothing and shaping the surface. The finest examples have walls less than a quarter-inch thick, requiring great skill to form and fire without cracking or warping. The painted decoration was applied with equal care, the lines confident and sure, despite the awkward curved surface of the pot. Firing was done in open pits or simple kilns, without the temperature control of later ceramic technology.
Yet, Predynastic potters managed to achieve consistent results,
producing vessels that were adequately fired, neither too soft nor over-fired to brittleness. The red surface color came from iron oxide in the clay, which turned red in an oxidizing atmosphere. Black-topped vessels required a reducing atmosphere at the end of firing, achieved by covering the kiln to limit oxygen and allow carbon to be absorbed into the clay surface. Pottery vessels served many purposes in Predynastic society. The most basic were for storage. Grain, water, oil, beer, and other commodities needed to be kept in containers. Undecorated storage jars, often quite large, made up the majority of pottery production. Cooking pots, subjected to repeated heating, were made with coarser clay and thicker walls. Serving vessels for eating and drinking were smaller and often more carefully made. But the decorated vessels found in graves clearly served purposes beyond mere utility. These were special objects, made with extraordinary care, decorated with meaningful symbols, selected to accompany the dead into the afterlife. They may have been prestige items in life as well, displayed in houses or used in ceremonies, visible markers of status and wealth. The investment of time and skill required to produce them suggests that they were valued, that ownership of such vessels meant something in the social calculus of Predynastic communities. Analysis of pottery fabrics, the clay and temper used in their manufacture, reveals patterns of production and exchange. Some vessels were made with clay from local sources, identifiable by its mineral content and characteristics. Others contain clay that must have come from elsewhere, sometimes hundreds of miles away, showing that pottery moved along trade networks, connecting different regions of the Nile Valley. Whether the pots themselves were traded, or whether potters traveled to different locations is difficult to determine, but the movement of ceramic styles and techniques across regions is clear. By the late Predynastic period, Merimda III, roughly 3200 to 3000 BC, decorated pottery began to decline. The elaborate painted designs characteristic of Merimda less common, replaced by simpler vessels, or by entirely different classes of objects. This shift corresponded with other changes in material culture, the appearance of stone vessels in increasing quantities, the development of metallurgy, the emergence of clear social hierarchies visible in burial patterns. Perhaps decorated pottery lost its role as a prestige item, as new forms of wealth and display became available. Stone vessels, carved from calcite, basalt, breccia, and other attractive stones, were extremely labor-intensive to produce. Creating a stone bowl required selecting a suitable piece of raw material, shaping it by pecking and grinding with harder stone tools, hollowing out the interior with the same slow process, then smoothing and polishing the finished product. A single vessel might represent weeks or months of skilled labor. Yet stone vessels became increasingly common in elite burials of the late Predynastic and early dynastic periods, visible markers of wealth and status that pottery could not match. The pottery itself, however, remained essential for daily life, and continued to be produced in vast quantities, undecorated, but often well-made vessels served the needs of cooking, storage, and serving. The technology and skills developed in the Predynastic period would persist throughout pharaonic history, adapting to new styles and technologies, but never disappearing. And the decorated vessels of Merimda II, buried in graves 5,000 years ago, survived to tell us something about the people who made and used them, their concerns and beliefs, the images and symbols that mattered to them. The tools that sustained Predynastic communities were products of technologies refined over millennia. Stone tools, particularly those made from flint, were the primary implements for cutting, scraping, piercing, and shaping materials. The technology of stone tool production was ancient, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years to the first humans who learned to strike one stone against another to create sharp edges. But the flint workers of Predynastic Egypt brought this ancient craft to a level of sophistication and artistry that remains impressive today. Flint is a form of silica that occurs in nodules within limestone formations. The nodules, weathering out of the limestone bedrock of the desert cliffs, could be collected from the surface or quarried from primary deposits. When struck properly, flint fractures in predictable ways, creating sharp edges and allowing skilled workers to control the shape of the resulting tool. The key is understanding how force applied at one point will propagate through the stone, how the angle and power of the blow determine where the flake will detach, how to prepare striking platforms and remove flakes in sequence to achieve the desired form. The earliest stone tools in Egypt, dating back to the Paleolithic period, hundreds of thousands of years ago, were simple choppers and hand axes. By the Predynastic period, tool-making had evolved considerably. Specialized tools for different tasks proliferated: blades for cutting, scrapers for working hides, borers for drilling holes, arrowheads for hunting, sickle blades for harvesting grain. The finest examples display remarkable craftsmanship, their surfaces worked by careful pressure flaking to create thin, symmetrical forms with delicate serrated edges. Bifacial knives, worked on both faces to create a leaf-shaped blade, represent the pinnacle of Predynastic flint working. Some of these knives were purely functional tools, but others seem to have been ceremonial objects. The most elaborate examples, like those found in elite burials, were so thin and finely worked that they probably could not have been used without breaking. Their purpose was symbolic rather than practical, displays of the maker's skill and the owner's wealth and status. The production of flint tools required not just technical knowledge, but access to good quality raw material. Flint working sites have been found near flint sources in the desert, places where nodules were collected and processed into rough preforms or blanks, then transported to settlements for final working into finished tools. The accumulations of waste flakes and broken pieces at these sites, sometimes many tons of discarded material, testify to the scale of flint tool production. Alongside flint, other stones were used for specialized tools. Grinding stones for processing grain were made from granite or other hard abrasive rocks. Pounding stones and hammers came from river cobbles or nodules of hard stone. Stone axes, made by pecking and grinding rather than flaking, were used for woodworking. Mace heads, ceremonial weapons or symbols of authority, were carefully shaped from hard stones like limestone, diorite, or even harder materials, their surfaces ground smooth and drilled to accept a wooden handle. The subsistence economy of Predynastic Egypt depended on a mix of agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting and fishing. The balance between these different food sources varied by region and over time, but all played important roles. Domesticated plants and animals provided the reliable foundation, while wild resources supplemented the diet and provided variety. Emmer wheat and barley were the staple crops, planted in the autumn after the flood receded and harvested in late spring before the next inundation. These crops were introduced to Egypt from the Levant, where plant domestication had occurred several thousand years earlier. Flax was also grown, providing fibers for textiles, as well as oil from its seeds. Other crops included lentils, peas and chickpeas, providing protein, onions and garlic for flavoring, and various fruits including dates, figs and grapes. Farming required sophisticated understanding of the annual flood cycle and the properties of Nile silt. Fields had to be prepared after the flood receded, the soil being soft and moist, ideal for planting. Wooden hoes or simple plows, possibly pulled by cattle, turned the earth. Seeds were broadcast by hand, then trampled into the soil by livestock driven across the field. As the crops grew, they were weeded and protected from birds and other pests. Irrigation, using channels to direct water from the river or from basins that collected floodwater, extended the growing season and increased yields. Harvest was labor-intensive, the grain being cut with sickles made of flint blades set in wooden or bone handles. The stalks were tied into sheaves and transported to threshing floors, where animals trampled the grain to separate the seeds from the chaff. Winnowing, tossing the grain in the air to let the wind carry away the lighter chaff, further cleaned the grain. The cleaned grain was then stored in silos or pits, protected from moisture and vermin as much as possible. Domesticated animals included cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. Cattle were particularly important, serving as draft animals for ploughing and transport, as well as providing milk, leather, and meat. Large-scale cattle herding, with animals moved to seasonal pastures in the delta marshes or desert fringes, seems to have been practiced. Sheep and goats were kept for wool, milk, and meat, though they were less prominent than in some other ancient Near Eastern societies. Pigs, well suited to the Nile environment, provided meat and were relatively easy to raise on household waste. Donkeys, domesticated by the late Predynastic period, became essential for transport. They could carry heavy loads over long distances, making overland trade more efficient. Dogs, descended from wolves, domesticated elsewhere, and brought to Egypt, served as hunting companions and guards. Cats would later be domesticated in Egypt, initially attracted to settlements by the presence of grain and the rodents that fed on it, but their domestication may not have occurred until later periods. Hunting remained important throughout the Predynastic period. The Nile Valley and its margins harbored abundant game: gazelles, ibexes, and other antelope in the desert, hippos and crocodiles in the river, waterfowl in the marshes. Rock art and pottery decoration show hunting scenes, men with bows stalking desert game, dogs assisting in the chase. Hunting provided not just food, but also materials: hides for leather, bones for tools, ivory from hippo tusks. Fishing was even more important. The Nile teemed with fish species that could be caught year-round. Simple technology, nets, baskets, hooks, and harpoons, allowed efficient fishing. Fish could be eaten fresh or preserved by drying or salting, providing protein that did not require the investment of raising domesticated animals. Fish remains are ubiquitous in archaeological sites, testimony to their importance in the diet. The Nile marshes provided other resources as well. Hopperus reeds growing in thick stands in shallow water were harvested for making rope, matting, sandals, and paper. Huatis flowers, valued for their beauty and symbolic associations, grew in the marshes. Waterfowl, ducks, geese, ibises could be caught with throwing sticks or trapped with nets. The marshes were rich, productive environments, contributing significantly to the resource base that supported predynastic communities. Metal began to appear in small quantities during the Predynastic period. Copper, obtained from Sinai, or the Eastern Desert, was worked into small tools, weapons, and ornaments. The technology was simple. Native copper, or copper ores, were heated in charcoal fires to temperatures high enough to melt the metal, which was then poured into molds or hammered into shape. Early copper objects were small and relatively simple: pins, awls, fishhooks, small blades, beads. Copper could not yet replace flint for most tools, but it represented the beginning of metallurgical knowledge that would eventually transform technology. The combination of stone tools, agricultural knowledge, animal domestication, hunting and fishing skills, and emerging metallurgy created a technological base adequate for supporting increasingly complex societies. The tools themselves, whether bone harpoons or flint sickle blades, represent accumulated generations of knowledge, each innovation built upon what came before, each generation inheriting and slightly improving the toolkit they passed on. Death in Predynastic Egypt was not an ending, but a transition, and the care lavished on burials reflects profound beliefs about the nature of existence and what lay beyond. The graves of this period, numbering in the thousands across archaeological sites along the Nile, provide our most detailed evidence about Predynastic society, revealing not just how people died, but how they lived, what they valued, how they understood the cosmos. The simplest graves were shallow pits, scooped into the desert sand, just deep enough to receive a body lying on its side in a contracted position, knees drawn up toward the chest. This posture, resembling sleep or the position of a child in the womb, was nearly universal in Predynastic burials. Hold in the womb was nearly universal in Predynastic burials. The body was laid on its left side, head pointing south, face turned west toward the setting sun. This orientation was not random, but reflected deep beliefs about death and the geography of the afterlife. With the body went possessions for the journey beyond death. Even the poorest graves usually contained a few items: a pottery jar, presumably holding food or drink, perhaps a stone tool or two, maybe a simple bead necklace or shell bracelet. Wealthier individuals received more abundant provisions: multiple pottery vessels, grinding stones, copper tools, cosmetic palettes, jewelry of semi-precious stones. The grave goods mirror the possessions people owned in life, suggesting a belief that the afterlife would be similar to earthly existence, requiring the same basic materials for comfort and survival. The dry desert sand naturally preserved bodies buried in these simple graves, without moisture, flesh-dried rather than rotting, creating natural mummies that could survive for millennia. When Predynastic cemeteries were first excavated in the late 19th century, archaeologists found bodies with skin, hair, and even fingernails intact. The features still recognizable after 5,000 years. This natural preservation may have influenced Egyptian beliefs about death and the persistence of the body, contributing to the development of deliberate mummification in later periods. As Predynastic society became more complex and hierarchical, graves reflected increasing social differentiation. Larger graves, sometimes lined with mud brick or wooden planks, received more elaborate burials. The body might be wrapped in linen or matting rather than simply being placed in the pit. Grave goods increased in quantity and quality, dozens of pottery vessels, stone vessels carved from fine materials, multiple grinding stones, copper tools and weapons, elaborate jewelry, cosmetic palettes, decorated with relief carving. The most elite burials of the late Predynastic period, particularly at sites like Hierakonpolis and Abydos, approached true tomb architecture. Chambers were excavated into the desert bedrock, or built of mud brick, sometimes with multiple rooms for storing grave goods. Wooden coffins, rare earlier, became more common. The deceased might be accompanied by elaborately decorated objects, carved ivory artifacts, stone vessels of exceptional quality, gold jewelry, objects that required specialist craftspeople to produce. Some burials included evidence of sacrifice. Animal burials, particularly of cattle, donkeys, and dogs, occurred in or near human graves, suggesting that valuable animals were killed to accompany their owners. More controversially, some excavators have reported evidence suggesting human sacrifice, retainers or servants buried with elite individuals, though this interpretation remains debated. If it occurred, it was probably rare and limited to the highest status burials. The organization of predynastic cemeteries reveals social structures and community organization. At some sites, graves cluster in groups that may represent family units or lineages buried together across generations. At others, clear spatial separation divides rich graves from poor, suggesting social classes that persisted through death. The largest cemeteries, like those at Nakada, contain thousands of burials spanning centuries, testament to stable settlement and population growth. Cemetery locations were carefully chosen. Burials were always in the low desert, above the floodplain, but not far into the barren waste. The dead remained close to the living, visible from settlements, part of the community landscape, even in death. Later Egyptians believed that the dead required offerings from their descendants to survive in the afterlife, and the proximity of cemeteries to settlements facilitated this ongoing relationship. Whether predynastic people held similar beliefs is uncertain, but the pattern suggests some continuity of thought. Grave robbery was a problem, even in ancient times. Many predynastic graves show signs of having been disturbed soon after burial, valuables removed, bodies displaced. The robbers were probably local people who knew where recent burials had occurred and what they contained. The fact that valuable objects were buried with the dead suggests that the need to provide for the deceased in the afterlife outweighed concerns about theft, or that protections against robbery, curses, fear of supernatural consequences were believed to be effective, even if they sometimes failed. What did predynastic Egyptians believe about the afterlife? Direct evidence is scarce, as these people left no written text describing their beliefs. We must infer from the archaeological record, always aware that our interpretations may be wrong or incomplete. The careful burial of the dead with provisions suggests a belief in some form of continued existence requiring material support. The orientation of bodies toward the west connects death with the setting sun, possibly implying that the dead journey to the western horizon where the sun disappears each night. Later Egyptian texts describe the west as the realm of the dead, ruled by Osiris, where the deceased underwent judgment, and, if found worthy, enjoyed an eternal afterlife in the field of reeds, a perfected version of the Nile Valley. How much of this elaborate mythology existed in predynastic times is unknown. Probably the beliefs were simpler, less systematized, more variable from region to region, but the core ideas that death was not annihilation, that the dead continued to exist in some form, that they required care and provisions, that proper burial mattered, seem to have been established early. The care lavished on burials, even simple ones, speaks of love and grief, emotions that transcend cultural boundaries and historical periods. Someone placed that jar of food in the grave, adjusted the position of the body, covered it gently with sand. Someone mourned, remembered, perhaps returned to leave offerings at the grave. The dead of 5 millennia ago were once living people who loved and were loved, who experienced joy and sorrow, whose lives mattered to those around them. The graves they left behind connect us, however tenuously, to their humanity. Water defined everything about life in the Nile Valley, and nothing was more important than the river's navigability. The Nile, flowing from south to north, provided a natural highway, connecting Upper Egypt to the Delta and the Mediterranean beyond. But travel on the river required boats, and the development of watercraft was crucial to the emergence of Egyptian civilization. The earliest boats were probably simple rafts made from bundles of papyrus reeds tied together. Papyrus, which grew abundantly in the marshes, was lightweight when dry, buoyant, and easily worked. A bundle of papyrus stalks, bound tightly together, would support a person's weight in the water. Larger bundles, shaped into elongated boat forms with upturned ends, could carry several people and their belongings. Such craft were perfect for navigating the marshes and for short trips on the river. Evidence for papyrus boats comes from several sources. Pottery and rock art from the Predynastic period frequently depict boats with high, curved prows and sterns, rendered in a way that suggests bundles of reeds rather than solid wooden hulls. Actual examples of ancient papyrus boats have not survived, as the reeds decay completely if not kept absolutely dry, but ethnographic parallels from other reed boat traditions worldwide and experimental archaeology show that such craft were practical and effective. As needs grew more complex, longer voyages, heavier cargoes, greater reliability, wooden boats supplemented and eventually replaced papyrus craft. Wood was scarce in Egypt, the native trees being mostly small species like acacia, tamarisk, and sycamore fig, unsuitable for large boat construction. But wood could be imported from the Levant, particularly cedar from Lebanon, or local woods could be used for smaller vessels or for boats built from short planks rather than long timbers. The construction technique for Egyptian wooden boats was distinctive, rather than building a skeleton of keel and ribs and attaching planks to this framework. Egyptian shipwrights created a shell of planks, joined edge to edge, then added internal bracing afterward. The planks were fastened together with mortise and tenon joints and sewn with rope, creating a hull that was flexible and, if constructed skillfully, surprisingly seaworthy. Actual examples of such boats have been found in boat pits associated with royal burials of the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods, providing detailed information about construction techniques. River boats had to deal with the Nile's peculiar conditions. The current flowed north at a fairly steady rate. Boats traveling downstream could simply drift with the current, using steering oars to maintain direction. But traveling upstream against the current required muscle power or sails. The prevailing wind in Egypt blows from the north, opposing the current. This meant that boats heading south could raise sails and let the wind push them upstream, while boats heading north could lower sails and drift with the current. This elegant system made two-way travel relatively easy, far simpler than on rivers where wind and current flow in the same direction. The importance of boats in Predynastic Egypt is reflected in their prominent appearance in art. Pottery vessels from Naqada II often feature elaborate boat scenes, sometimes showing multiple vessels in procession. The boats carry cabins or shrines, standards or emblems, banks of oars. Human figures appear on deck, sometimes apparently engaged in ritual activities. These representations suggest that boats were not merely practical transportation, but held symbolic or religious significance. Some scholars interpret these boat scenes as depicting funerary processions, the dead being transported by river to burial grounds. Others see religious festivals or pilgrimages, journeys to sacred sites associated with particular deities. The truth may encompass both interpretations and more. Boats were essential to life in the Nile Valley, and their importance naturally extended into the symbolic and religious realm. The river itself was understood in spiritual terms. Later Egyptian texts described the sun god Ras as traveling across the sky in a boat during the day and through the underworld in another boat at night. The daily solar cycle was envisioned as a river journey, death and rebirth, conceptualized as voyages through watery realms. How much of this mythology existed in predynastic times is uncertain, but the frequent association of boats with burials and religious contexts suggests that water travel held meanings beyond mere transportation. The Nile also posed dangers. Hippos, dangerous and unpredictable, inhabited the river and could overturn boats or attack people near the water. Crocodiles, equally hazardous, lurked in the shallows and along the banks. Rapids and rocks, particularly near the cataracts, where hard stone crossed the river channel, created hazardous conditions. Skilled navigation and knowledge of the river's moods were essential for safe travel. Fishing from boats was a major food-gathering activity. Nets could be deployed from boats to catch fish in deeper water. Harpoons or spears could be used to hunt larger fish or to kill hippos. Boats also provided platforms for hunting waterfowl in the marshes, allowing hunters to get close to flocks of ducks and geese. The centrality of boats and river travel to Egyptian life persisted throughout pharaonic history. The unification of Egypt under a single ruler was probably only possible because the Nile provided a communication and transportation network connecting the entire country. Armies could be moved by boat. Trade goods could be shipped hundreds of miles. Administrative messages could travel from Memphis to Aswan in a matter of weeks rather than the months. Such a journey would require overland The river made Egypt into a coherent political and cultural unit, despite its great length. Standing on the bank of the Nile today, watching feluccas with their distinctive triangular sails moving across the water, one can imagine how it was 5,000 years ago. The boats are different in details, but similar in principle, still using wind and current to move up and down the river. The connection to the past remains tangible, the continuity visible, the river still the central fact of Egyptian life, despite all the changes that modernity has brought. Among the most striking objects from late Predynastic Egypt are large carved stone palettes and ceremonial mace heads, objects that seem to mark the transition from prehistory to history, from village societies to unified statehood. These items, often elaborately decorated with relief carvings, provide some of our earliest glimpses into the development of kingship and state-level organization. Palettes for grinding cosmetics have been part of Egyptian material culture since the earliest Predynastic period. Small examples, made from schist or other fine-grained stone, were common grave goods. They were used to grind malachite, galena, and other minerals into powder for eye paint, a practice that served both cosmetic and practical purposes. These utilitarian palettes were simple in form, often shaped like animals or geometric designs, with a smooth grinding surface. By the late Predynastic period, palettes began to grow larger and more elaborate. Some examples reached 2 feet or more in length, far too large for actual cosmetic use. These ceremonial palettes were decorated with relief carvings, showing complex scenes, animals in combat, human figures, symbols, and hieroglyphs. They were clearly prestige objects, probably used in temple rituals or displayed as markers of authority, no longer functional tools but symbols of power and religious sanction. The most famous of these is the Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis and dating to around 3100 BC, right at the cusp of the early dynastic period. This shield-shaped palette, carved from a single piece of dark green schist, bears on both faces elaborate scenes associated with King Narmer, often identified as the ruler who unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. On one side, Narmer appears wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, his arm raised to strike a kneeling captive, whom he grasps by the hair. Behind him, a sandal bearer attends. Above the captive, a falcon, the god Horus, perches on a clump of papyrus plants, from which emerges a human head, symbolically representing the conquest of the Delta region. Below the main scene, 2 fallen enemies lie defeated. On the reverse side, Narmer wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, striding behind standard bearers to inspect rows of decapitated enemies. Below this, 2 fantastic creatures, with intertwined serpent-like necks, create the circular depression that marks the palette's original cosmetic grinding function, though on this scale, it's clearly symbolic rather than practical. At the bottom, a bull probably representing the king tramples an enemy and breaks down the walls of a fortified town. The Narmer palette has been analyzed exhaustively by scholars seeking to understand early Egyptian kingship and the process of political unification. The combination of Upper and Lower Egyptian crowns suggests that Narmer ruled both regions. The scenes of violence and conquest indicate that unification involved warfare, though whether Narmer himself achieved unification or commemorated an earlier achievement by an ancestor remains debated. De Sibium wordball to Isen trupation, Subamindering de Forg, the Sibium devow, Isen tiva to Sibia. The scenes of violence and conquest indicate that unification involved warfare, though whether Narmer himself achieved unification involved warfare. Though whether Narmer himself achieved unification or commemorated an earlier achievement by an ancestor remains debated. The presence of hieroglyphic labels identifies the king and provides context, though the writing is too early and limited to offer detailed historical narrative. Other ceremonial palettes from this period show similar themes. The 2 dogs palette, the bull palette, the battlefield palette, all depict violence, conquest, and royal power. Animals, possibly representing different polities or regions, appear in combat. Fortified settlements are shown being attacked. Bodies of defeated enemies litter the ground. These are not peaceful images, but scenes of conflict and domination, suggesting that the path to unified statehood was contested and violent. Ceremonial mace heads tell similar stories.
Acers had long been weapons, stone heads mounted on wooden handles and used in close combat. Large ceremonial mace heads, beautifully carved from hard stone, served symbolic rather than practical purposes. The most famous examples associated with Kings Scorpion and Narmer show rulers performing rituals and wielding authority.
The scorpion mace head shows a king, identified by the scorpion hieroglyph, wearing the white crown and holding a hoe, apparently performing a ceremonial act related to irrigation or agriculture. Attendants surround him, and standards bearing symbols of various nomes or districts are displayed, suggesting the king's authority over multiple regions. Other scenes on the mace head show bound captives and piles of booty, again indicating military conquest. These objects, pallets and mace heads, were found in temple deposits, particularly at Hierakonpolis, which seems to have been an important religious center in the late Predynastic period. They were probably dedicatory offerings, objects made to honor the gods and commemorate royal achievements. Their elaborate decoration and the skill required to carve them demonstrate the existence of specialist craftspeople working under royal patronage, creating art that served political and religious purposes. The iconography of these objects draws on older Predynastic artistic traditions, while introducing new elements that would become standard in pharaonic art. The king is shown larger than other figures, emphasizing his superhuman status. He wears distinctive crowns and regalia, marking his office. He smites enemies and performs rituals, the two fundamental aspects of kingship. Animals represent both real creatures and symbolic forces. Hieroglyphic labels identify people and places, the beginnings of written historical record. What the pallets and mace heads reveal is the emergence of kingship as an institution. The ruler is no longer simply a successful warrior or wealthy individual, but a sacred figure, mediator between human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining cosmic order. This ideological framework, visible in nascent form in late Predynastic art, would endure throughout Egyptian history. The king was not just a political leader, but a religious figure, a living god whose proper performance of rituals ensured the Nile's flood, the sun's rising, the defeat of chaos. The craftsmanship of these objects is extraordinary. Carving relief scenes into hard stone required immense skill and patience. The stone had to be pecked and ground with harder stone tools or copper chisels, a process requiring hours of painstaking work for each square inch of decorated surface. The artists who created these pieces understood composition, could render human and animal forms convincingly, could organize complex multi-register scenes into coherent narratives. This level of artistic achievement did not arise spontaneously, but developed from generations of craft tradition. Examining these pallets and mace heads today, in the hushed galleries of museums, one confronts the moment when Egypt stepped from prehistory into history, when the decentralized village cultures of the Predynastic period coalesced into something new, a unified territorial state under divine kingship, the foundations of 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. These carved stones, created to impress contemporaries and honor gods, have outlasted the kingdoms they commemorate, speaking still of power and ambition, of violence and order, of the human drive to create lasting monuments. The transformation of Predynastic Egypt, from a collection of autonomous village communities into a unified territorial state, ranks among the most significant political developments in human history. This process, which unfolded over several centuries during the late 4th millennium BC, involved the gradual concentration of power, the emergence of regional centers, and ultimately the establishment of a single ruler, claiming authority over the entire Nile Valley, from the Delta to the First Cataract. The archaeological evidence for this process is frustratingly incomplete, offering glimpses rather than a comprehensive narrative. We see its effects: increasingly large settlements, more elaborate elite burials, evidence of warfare and fortification, the appearance of administrative technologies like writing, but the mechanisms remain partly obscure. Was unification achieved primarily through military conquest, with one region subjugating others by force, through marriage alliances and gradual diplomatic integration, through economic dominance, with control of trade routes and resources, translating into political power? Probably all these factors played roles, varying in importance at different times and places. The earliest stages of political complexity are visible in the archaeological record of Nekada the First, around 4000 to 3500 BC. Settlements began to show signs of social differentiation. Some houses were larger and better constructed than others. Burials varied widely in the quantity and quality of grave goods, suggesting the emergence of wealth inequality. Certain locations positioned advantageously for trade or agricultural production grew larger and presumably more influential than their neighbors. By Nekada II, from 3500 to 3200 BC, these trends accelerated dramatically. A handful of sites emerged as regional centers, substantially larger than surrounding settlements. Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, Ancient Nekhen became one such center, its population perhaps reaching several thousand people. The site included densely packed residential areas, craft production zones, temples or shrines, and an extensive cemetery with burials ranging from simple pit graves to large tomb complexes. Emdesta at Hierakonpolis. Excavations have revealed a large ceremonial complex, including what may be Egypt's earliest temple, a structure of mud, brick and wood, with a courtyard and pillared hall. Nearby, a cache of remarkable objects was discovered, including the Nama palette and other ceremonial items. The wealth concentrated at Hierakonpolis, visible in gold jewelry, fine stone vessels, imported goods, and elaborate crafts, indicates that this was a center of power, a place where rulers and elites lived, and where artisans produced prestige goods. Other centers emerged as well. Nakada itself was a major settlement, Abydos, later the cult center of Osiris and burial place of early kings, was already important in the Predynastic period. In the Delta, sites like Buto and Madi became centers of northern culture, distinct in some respects from Upper Egyptian sites, but connected through trade and exchange. The relationship between these centers was probably complex and shifting. Some may have dominated smaller satellite communities in hierarchical relationships. Others may have existed as independent polities, competing and cooperating as circumstances dictated. Evidence of warfare increases during this period. Fortification walls appear at some settlements. Art depicts battle scenes and bound captives. Skeletal remains show traumatic injuries consistent with violent conflict. Control of trade routes likely played a crucial role in the rise of regional centers. Hierakonpolis was well positioned to control traffic on the Nile and routes to the eastern desert gold mines. Nakada commanded the point where the Wadi Hammamat, the main route to the Red Sea, reached the Nile Valley. Abydos controlled access to desert routes to the western oases, centers that could monopolize trade in luxury goods, gold, copper, semi-precious stones, exotic materials from beyond Egypt, accumulated wealth that translated into political power. The emergence of craft specialization both reflected and reinforced political centralization. The production of fine pottery, stone vessels, jewelry, and metalwork required skilled artisans who had to be supported by agricultural surplus. These specialists often worked under the patronage of elites, creating prestige goods that displayed wealth and status. The concentration of craft production at major centers is visible in the archaeological record, with workshops for different crafts identifiable within settlements. Religious authority also contributed to political power. Temples and shrines served as focal points for community identity and ritual life. Those who controlled religious institutions, who could perform necessary rituals and intercede with the gods, wielded influence beyond mere economic or military power. The later fusion of kingship and divinity, with the pharaoh understood as a living god, had its roots in this predynastic period when religious and political authority began to merge. The invention of writing, appearing around 3200 BC, was both a product of increasing political complexity and a tool that enabled further centralization. The earliest hieroglyphs appear on labels attached to goods, identifying contents and ownership, facilitating administration of complex economies. Soon writing expanded to record names, titles and events, creating the possibility of historical record and bureaucratic control across distance. By around 3100 BC, at the beginning of the early dynastic period, Egypt had achieved political unification under a single ruler. The traditional narrative, based on later Egyptian king lists and texts, credits this unification to a king named Menes, who conquered the Delta and established his capital at Memphis, at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. Modern scholars identify Menes with either Nama or his immediate successor Hora-Her, based on archaeological evidence and the names appearing on early monuments. The reality was probably more complicated than a single dramatic conquest. Unification may have been a process spanning several generations, with different rulers consolidating control over different regions, with setbacks and reversals, with the final achievement being as much consolidation of earlier gains as new conquest. The symbolic importance placed on unification in later Egyptian ideology, the pharaoh perpetually reenacting the conquest of north and south, wearing both crowns, bearing titles like Lord of the Two Lands, suggests that it was neither simple nor entirely secure. What caused unification to happen when it did? Why around 3100 BC, rather than earlier or later? Scholars have proposed various theories. Environmental change, particularly the final desiccation of the Sahara, may have driven population into the Nile Valley, increasing pressure and competition. Trade and contact with other early states in Mesopotamia, may have provided models and incentives for political centralization. The internal dynamics of Egyptian society, with successful regional centers expanding their control, may have created a momentum toward larger political units. Likely multiple factors converged to make unification possible and desirable. The unified state that emerged was unlike anything Egypt had known before. A king claiming divine authority ruled from Memphis, supported by an administration of officials who collected taxes, managed irrigation systems, organized labor for monumental construction, and enforced royal will. The kingdom was divided into administrative districts, nomes, each with its own governor appointed by the king. A standing army, at least a corps of professional soldiers supplemented by conscripted labor when needed, protected the kingdom and projected power beyond its borders. This new political order required ideological justification. The king was not merely a powerful individual, but a sacred figure, the earthly embodiment of Horus, responsible for maintaining Maut, the cosmic order. Royal rituals, particularly said Festival of Renewal, reinforced this divine kingship. Monumental architecture, beginning with elaborate tombs and soon expanding to temples and pyramids, displayed royal power and resources on an unprecedented scale. The process by which Egypt transformed from village communities to unified state took roughly 1,000 years, from the earliest predynastic settlements around 5000 BC to the first dynasty around 3100 BC. This was not a linear progression, but a complex historical process with its own dynamics, driven by economic change, demographic pressure, military conflict, ideological development, and human ambition. The end result, a state that would endure, in various forms for 3 millennia, was built on foundations laid during these predynastic centuries. The appearance of writing in Egypt around 3200 BC represents one of the great intellectual achievements in human history, ranking alongside the independent invention of writing in Mesopotamia, China, and Mesoamerica. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, with its combination of logographic and phonetic elements, its aesthetic beauty, and its long continuous use spanning 3,000 years, became one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization. The earliest writing in Egypt appears on small labels, usually made of bone or ivory, attached to containers of goods. These labels identify contents, ownership, or origin, serving administrative purposes in increasingly complex economies. The symbols used include both pictograms, representing objects directly, a jar, a loaf of bread, a palace facade, and phonetic signs, representing sounds. This combination of semantic and phonetic writing characterizes the hieroglyphic system throughout its history. The development of writing did not occur in isolation, but was part of broader developments in administration and state formation. As political units grew larger and more complex, as tribute and taxes flowed to central authorities, as specialized craftspeople produced goods for elite patrons, the need for record-keeping increased. Memory and oral tradition could only handle so much complexity. Writing allowed information to be stored, transferred across distance, and preserved across time. The earliest substantial hieroglyphic inscriptions appear on ceremonial objects, like the Nama palette and royal mace heads, identifying kings and commemorating events. These inscriptions are brief, often just names and titles, but they represent a crucial step from purely administrative notation to historical record. By the early dynastic period, longer texts appear, including year names that recorded significant events of each ruler's reign, creating a framework for historical chronology. The hieroglyphic system that emerged was sophisticated and flexible. It included several hundred signs, some representing whole words or concepts, others representing consonant sounds. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing recorded consonants, but not vowels, similar to some other Semitic writing systems. Words could be spelled phonetically, with sound signs, or written with logograms, with phonetic complements added for clarity, or with a combination of approaches. Determinatives, signs placed at the end of words to indicate their category or meaning, help disambiguate words that might otherwise be confused. The aesthetic quality of hieroglyphic writing was important from the beginning. Signs were carefully formed, arranged to create balanced compositions. Hieroglyphs could be written in horizontal rows, reading left to right or right to left, or in vertical columns, reading top to bottom. The direction of reading was indicated by the orientation of the signs. Human and animal figures faced toward the beginning of the text. This flexibility allowed scribes to integrate writing with visual art, creating inscriptions that were both readable and beautiful. Not all writing was hieroglyphic. For everyday purposes, a cursive script called hieratic developed early, using simplified forms of hieroglyphic signs, written with a reed brush on papyrus or other surfaces. Hieratic was faster to write than formal hieroglyphs, and became the standard script for administrative documents, letters, and literary texts. Hieroglyphs continued to be used for monumental inscriptions, religious texts, and formal contexts where aesthetic considerations mattered. The physical materials of writing shaped how it was used. Papyrus, made from the pith of papyrus plants cut into strips, laid crosswise and pressed together, provided a smooth surface suitable for writing with reed brushes and ink. Egypt's dry climate allowed papyrus documents to survive for millennia if kept away from moisture. Stone inscriptions, carved into temple walls or freestanding stelae, provided permanent records meant to last forever. Limestone chips or pottery sherds, called ostraca, served as scratch paper for rough drafts, student exercises, and informal notes. The emergence of writing created a new class of specialists, scribes. Literacy was never widespread in ancient Egypt, probably remaining below 10% of the population throughout pharaonic history. Scribes, trained in writing and arithmetic, formed the administrative backbone of the state. They kept records, wrote letters, calculated taxes, copied texts. Scribe training began in childhood, requiring years of practice copying standard texts and exercises. Successful scribes could rise to high administrative positions, becoming wealthy and influential. What writing made possible was transformative. Historical records could be maintained, allowing later generations to know what earlier rulers had accomplished. Religious texts could be standardized and transmitted. Literature could be composed and preserved. Legal documents could record property transfers and contracts. Scientific and technical knowledge could be accumulated and refined. The very nature of knowledge changed when it could be written down, studied, revised, and passed on through texts, rather than just oral tradition. Yet writing also had limitations and biases. What was written down represented the concerns and perspectives of elites and the state apparatus. The lives of ordinary people, their thoughts and stories, rarely appear in the written record, except incidentally. Writing preserved what those in power wanted preserved, shaping historical memory in ways that served their interests. The invention of writing did not make history objective or complete, but created new ways for particular narratives to be privileged and perpetuated. The hieroglyphic writing system would endure until the end of ancient Egyptian civilization. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 AD, carved on the walls of the Temple of Isis at Philae. After that, knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost, not to be recovered until Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in 1822. For nearly 1500 years, the hieroglyphs remained visible on monuments throughout Egypt, but incomprehensible. Their messages silent, their history forgotten. The rediscovery of how to read hieroglyphs opened ancient Egypt to modern understanding in revolutionary ways. Suddenly text could be read, names identified, events dated, beliefs and practices understood through the Egyptians' own words, rather than just archaeological inference. The decipherment transformed Egyptology from antiquarianism into a historical discipline, revealing the ancient Egyptian voice speaking across millennia. Standing before a hieroglyphic inscription today, one confronts this remarkable achievement. A writing system that combined practical utility with aesthetic beauty, that served mundane record-keeping and sacred texts alike, that preserved 3,000 years of human thought and experience. The invention of writing in Predynastic Egypt, appearing almost simultaneously with political unification, marked the boundary between prehistory and history, between societies known only through material remains, and those that speak to us directly through their own words. At Abydos, in Middle Egypt, a royal cemetery preserves the tombs of Egypt's first kings, shadowy figures who ruled at the dawn of pharaonic civilization. These tombs, excavated over the past century and still yielding new information, provide crucial evidence about the early dynastic period and the transition from predynastic chiefdoms to unified monarchy. The cemetery, known as Kab, or Mother of Pots, for the countless pottery sherds littering the surface, occupies a bay in the desert cliffs west of the Nile floodplain. The location was not chosen randomly. Abydos was already sacred in predynastic times, possibly associated with mortuary cults or beliefs about the afterlife. By locating their tombs here, early kings connected themselves to this sacred landscape and its ancient associations. The earliest royal tombs, dating to Dynasty 0 and the first kings of Dynasty 1, were relatively simple structures by later standards. Yet they represented a massive investment of resources and labor, Each consisted of a large rectangular pit excavated into the desert bedrock, subdivided into multiple chambers by brick walls. The central chamber housed the king's burial. Surrounding chambers contained grave goods, pottery jars filled with grain, wine, and oil, stone vessels, furniture, clothing, jewelry, weapons. The tombs grew increasingly elaborate over time. The tomb of King Dera's second ruler of Dynasty I comprised a complex of chambers covering an area of roughly 70 by 40 feet, with thick mud brick walls. The ceiling was formed from wooden beams, over which was built a sand mound, probably visible as a low tumulus on the desert surface, marking the location. Later tombs added architectural refinements, better quality brickwork, more carefully planned layouts, decorated elements. Surrounding the royal tomb were rows of subsidiary burials, smaller tombs containing the bodies of retainers, servants, and courtiers. These subsidiary burials have sparked intense scholarly debate. Were these people sacrificed at the king's funeral, killed to accompany their master into death? Or did they die naturally at different times and receive the honor of burial near the king? The evidence is ambiguous. Some subsidiary burials seem contemporary with the royal tomb, suggesting simultaneous burial. Others show signs of later addition. If human sacrifice did occur, it was probably limited to this earliest period. By the time of the Old Kingdom, subsidiary burials had ceased, replaced by tomb statues and servant figures meant to serve the deceased magically, rather than through actual human attendance. The practice, if it occurred, speaks to the immense power early kings wielded and the absolute nature of their authority, but also to an aspect of early Egyptian civilization that later generations apparently found unacceptable. The grave goods from these early royal tombs, many looted in antiquity, but enough surviving to indicate their original richness, demonstrate the wealth and artistic achievement of early dynastic Egypt. Stone vessels carved from calcite, basalt, and other hard stones number in the hundreds, requiring enormous investments of skilled labor to produce gold jewelry, including the earliest examples of Egyptian goldwork, displays sophisticated techniques of hammering and granulation. Ivory labels and ceremonial objects feature delicate relief carving. Furniture, reconstructed from surviving fragments, included beds, chairs, and chests of fine craftsmanship. Wine jars, imported from the Levant, contained residues analyzable by modern chemistry, revealing that Egyptian kings were drinking wine from Palestine 3,000 years before Christ. Seal impressions on jar stoppers record administrative information and royal names, providing evidence for historical chronology and administrative organization. Even the pottery, mass-produced utilitarian vessels, shows standardization and quality control, suggesting organized workshops and specialized production. The kings buried at Abydos are known primarily from their tomb architecture, grave goods, and brief inscriptions. Whole King Narmer, possibly the unifier of Egypt, left the famous pallet bearing his name. King Aha, his successor, was buried with enormous quantities of grave goods and subsidiary burials. Den, a later First Dynasty king, introduced innovations in tomb architecture and left inscriptions recording military campaigns and festivals. Each king contributed to the development of pharaonic institution, refining and elaborating the trappings and ideology of divine monarchy. Interestingly, these early kings also built tombs or large funerary structures at Saqqara, near Memphis in the north, leading to scholarly debate about which tombs actually contained royal burials. The current consensus suggests that the Abydos tombs were the actual burial places, while the Saqqara structures served as cenotaphs or memorial monuments, maintaining royal presence at the capital. This dual tomb tradition speaks to the importance both regions held in early Egyptian consciousness. The location of the Abydos cemetery continued to hold religious significance long after the early dynastic period. During the Middle Kingdom, Abydos became the primary cult center of Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection. Pilgrims traveled to Abydos to participate in mysteries celebrating Osiris's death and rebirth. The ancient royal tombs were reinterpreted as Osiris's tomb, and the site became one of the holiest places in Egypt. People erected memorial stelae at Abydos to ensure they would be remembered and receive offerings in the afterlife, even if their actual bodies were buried elsewhere. Walking through the ruins of el Kab today, one sees low brick walls, sand-filled chambers, scattered pottery sherds. The superstructures have vanished. The grave goods removed to museums, the bodies of those buried here, long since decayed to nothing. Yet the site retains a haunting quality, a sense of great age and significance. Here was buried King Narmer, who may have unified Egypt. Here lay King Der, whose tomb would later be venerated as Osiris's burial place. Here were placed the foundations of pharaonic civilization. the first experiments in divine kingship and monumental burial. The tombs at Abydos represent a crucial stage in the development of Egyptian mortuary architecture, lying between the simple predynastic pit graves and the massive pyramids of the Old Kingdom. They show Egyptian society learning to mobilize labor on unprecedented scales, developing architectural techniques and administrative systems that would be refined and elaborated in later periods. They reveal a society with strong beliefs about the afterlife, willing to invest enormous resources in proper burial for its rulers. The early kings buried at Abydos ruled over a newly unified Egypt, facing challenges of establishing legitimacy, creating administrative structures, defending borders, maintaining the flood-dependent agricultural system that sustained their kingdom. They were innovators and consolidators, building on predynastic foundations while creating something genuinely new. Their tombs, modest by later standards, but revolutionary for their time, mark the beginning of 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, the achievement that made Egypt. The river continues its slow progress toward the sea, carrying water and silt from the heart of Africa, sustaining the narrow ribbon of green that made civilization possible. 5,000 years have passed since the Predynastic period, yet the Nile remains fundamentally unchanged despite all the dams and irrigation systems humans have imposed upon it. The annual flood no longer comes, trapped behind the high dam at Aswan, but the river flows on, patient and eternal. Standing on the bank of the Nile today, one can still sense the rhythm that shaped everything. The morning light catches on the water's surface, creating shifting patterns of gold and green. Date palms line the shore, their fronds rustling in the wind that blows eternally from the north. Feluccas drift past, their white sails catching the breeze, moving up the river as boats have done for 5 millennia. In the fields beyond, farmers tend crops of wheat and barley, descendants of the first domesticated grains brought to Egypt in the Predynastic period. The fundamental geography remains. The black land and red land still divide at sharp boundaries. The desert cliffs still rise above the valley, golden in the afternoon sun. The sky arches overhead, impossibly blue, almost cloudless, except during the brief winter rains. The landscape that shaped Egyptian civilization persists, even as the civilization itself has transformed beyond recognition. The Predynastic period, that 1,000-year span from roughly 5,000 to 3,100 BC, was when everything began. The first farmers settled along the Nile, learning to work with its flood cycles. Villages grew into towns, towns into regional centers. Pottery evolved from simple containers to elaborate painted vessels. Beliefs about death and the afterlife took shape. Visible in carefully prepared burials, tools improved, crafts specialized, trade networks expanded. Social hierarchies emerged, crystallizing eventually into kingship and statehood. These were not primitive people stumbling towards civilization, but sophisticated societies adapting to their environment, solving problems, creating culture. They developed agricultural systems suited to Egyptian conditions, learning through generations of experience when to plant, how to manage irrigation, which crops thrived in Nile silt. They invented distinctive artistic styles, visible in pottery decoration and stone carving, creating aesthetic traditions that would endure and evolve throughout pharaonic history. They built villages of mud and reed that housed families for generations, creating communities bound by kinship, shared labor, and common beliefs. They buried their dead with care, provisioning them for journeys beyond death, suggesting concepts of afterlife and cosmic order that would be elaborated in later periods. They traded along the Nile and beyond, connecting Egyptian communities to each other and to the wider ancient world. The archaeological record, fragmentary and incomplete, preserves only portions of what once existed. So much has vanished: voices and stories, songs and rituals, relationships and emotions, the texture of daily life. We have pots and tools, bones and buildings, but the people who made and used these things remain shadowy, known only through inference and imagination. Yet even the fragments tell us much. They reveal societies undergoing transformation, adapting to challenges, creating solutions that worked well enough to persist and develop. By the end of the Predynastic period, Egypt stood poised for the great achievements we associate with pharaonic civilization. Political unification created a framework for organizing labor and resources on unprecedented scales. Writing enabled administration across distance and preservation of knowledge across time. Religious ideology developed that placed the king at the center of cosmic order, mediating between human and divine realms. Artistic and architectural traditions evolved that would produce the pyramids, temples, and sculptures we admire today. But none of this would have been possible without the foundations laid during the Predynastic period. The agricultural surplus that fed pyramid builders came from farming techniques refined over millennia of Nile Valley agriculture. The organizational skills that mobilized tens of thousands of workers had their origins in community labor for village projects. The artistic achievements of later periods built upon aesthetic traditions established in predynastic pottery and stone carving. The religious beliefs that justified divine kingship evolved from earlier concepts visible in predynastic burial practices. The predynastic period was not merely prelude, but foundation, not just preparation for what came later, but valuable and significant in itself. These were the centuries when Egyptian civilization took shape, when the Nile Valley peoples created distinctive solutions to their particular circumstances, when the patterns that would endure for 3,000 years were established. We are accustomed to thinking of ancient Egypt as a civilization of pyramids and pharaohs, of hieroglyphs and mummies, of great stone temples and golden treasures. All these things belong to later periods, to the Old Kingdom and beyond. But before the pyramids, before the hieroglyphs were fully developed, before the institution of pharaonic kingship was established, there were people living along the Nile, farming its banks, burying their dead in the desert, creating pottery and tools, developing beliefs and practices. These predynastic people, whose names we rarely know, whose stories survive only in fragments, were the true founders of Egyptian civilization. They adapted to one of the world's most distinctive environments, turning the challenges of the Nile Valley into opportunities. They created societies that were sustainable and successful, that supported growing populations, that generated surplus for specialists and craft production, that developed the conceptual and practical foundations for statehood. The transition from predynastic village societies to the unified Egyptian state was gradual, occurring over centuries, driven by demographic pressure, economic change, military conflict, and ideological development. It was not inevitable or foreordained but contingent, the result of human choices and historical circumstances that could have turned out differently. Yet once achieved, unification proved remarkably durable, creating a political and cultural framework that would persist, with modifications and interruptions, from the first dynasty around 3100 BC to the end of the Ptolemaic period in 30 BC. That 3,000-year span of pharaonic civilization rests upon predynastic foundations. The flood agriculture that sustained millions of people was developed in predynastic villages. The trade networks that brought gold from Nubia and cedar from Lebanon had predynastic origins. The artistic styles that characterize Egyptian culture emerged from predynastic traditions. The religious beliefs that placed the king at the center of cosmic order evolved from predynastic concepts of death and the afterlife. Walking through museum galleries, displaying predynastic pottery, stone tools, and simple burials, one might be tempted to hurry past toward the more spectacular achievements of later periods. But to understand Egypt, to grasp how one of history's great civilizations emerged and flourished, requires attention to these beginnings. The painted jar from Nakada, the flint knife from Hierakonpolis, the simple grave with its few offerings. These objects connect us to the people who created Egyptian civilization, who made the choices and developed the practices that everything else would build upon. The Nile flows on, indifferent to human history, following patterns established by geology and climate. But human history along the Nile was not predetermined by geography. The river provided possibilities, constraints, and opportunities. What people made of those possibilities was up to them. The predynastic inhabitants of the Nile Valley created a distinctive civilization, adapted to their specific environment, drawing upon their own creativity and the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. 5,000 years later, we can still see their legacy. The fields of wheat and barley, the mud brick houses, the boats on the river, the cemeteries in the desert, all continue in forms recognizable from predynastic times. Egyptian civilization in its pharaonic form has ended. Its temples abandoned, its writing forgotten for centuries, its religion replaced by Islam and Christianity. Yet something persists, a continuity of place and practice stretching back to those first farmers who settled along the Nile and learned to live with its rhythms. The memory of the flood, the annual inundation that made Egypt possible, remains even though the flood itself has ended. Every Egyptian knows the story, understands the historical importance, can explain how civilization depended on that regular renewal of fertility. The flood is gone, controlled and contained by modern engineering, but its significance endures in memory and understanding. So too with the predynastic period. These centuries have left relatively few monuments, no pyramids or temples, no great inscriptions or literary texts. But they left something more fundamental: the patterns and practices, beliefs and techniques, social structures and cultural forms that made Egyptian civilization possible. Understanding the Predynastic period means understanding beginnings, seeing how complex civilizations emerge from simpler foundations, recognizing that what seems natural and inevitable is actually the product of human creativity and adaptation across generations. The people of Predynastic Egypt, farmers and potters, tool makers and traders, parents and children, were fully human in their aspirations and concerns, their joys and sorrows, their efforts to create meaningful lives in a challenging environment. They succeeded, creating communities that endured, that grew, that developed into one of history's great civilizations. Their success was not guaranteed, but achieved through work and wisdom, through adaptation and innovation, through cooperation and conflict. We are their heirs, inheritors of the world they made, and the knowledge they accumulated, the agricultural techniques they developed, the artistic traditions they established, the social organizations they created, the beliefs they held. All these fed into later developments, shaping pharaonic civilization, and through it, contributing to the wider heritage of humanity. Egyptian mathematics and medicine, art and architecture, literature and religion have influenced countless societies across millennia. But more than specific contributions, the Predynastic period offers a lesson in human adaptability and creativity. People confronting the challenges of a specific environment, drawing upon their own intelligence and the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors, creating solutions that worked, building societies that endured. This is a fundamentally human story, repeated in different forms across the world, always specific to particular circumstances, but sharing common themes of adaptation and achievement. The Nile Valley before the pyramids was a place of villages and farms, of simple burials and painted pots, of stone tools and mud brick houses. It was a place where people lived and died, where they raised children and tended crops, where they created beauty and meaning within the constraints of their world. From these humble foundations grew one of history's most magnificent civilizations, but the foundations themselves deserve recognition and respect. As the sun sets over the Nile today, the river turns to gold and then to shadow, the familiar daily cycle continuing as it has for millions of years. The people who watched this same sunset 5,000 years ago are gone, their bones long since turned to dust, their names mostly forgotten, their villages dissolved back into the earth. But their legacy remains, visible in the patterns of settlement along the river, in the fields of grain stretching to the desert's edge, in the persistence of forms and practices across millennia. The story of ancient Egypt before the pyramids is a story of beginnings, of the slow accumulation of knowledge, and the gradual development of complex societies. It reminds us that great civilizations do not spring fully formed but grow from small seeds, nurtured by generations of human effort and insight. It shows us people like ourselves, confronting challenges, finding solutions, creating culture, making history. And it preserves, however imperfectly, a record of those achievements, allowing us to glimpse a world long vanished but still speaking to us across the gulf of time.